Good morning and welcome to James Cooper Kreston's 2024 Spring Budget Briefing. I'm Sue Staunton, Managing Partner of James Cooper Kreston, and to discuss the impact of the budget with us this morning, I'm delighted to be joined by, on my left, Alan Poole, Audit and Advisory Partner and Head of our Technology team, and on my right, Phil Snell, Head of our Business Tax team, and on his right, Sharon O'Markay, who leads our PCS team, Private Client Services team. During this briefing, I'm going to be posing questions to the panel, but if you'd like to ask a question of them, please do enter that on the box on your screen as we go along, and I'll try and make sure that we address as many of those questions as possible during this morning's session. So, given the proximity of a general election, this budget has been much heralded as being an election budget. But was it really? What do you think? We're going to launch one of our polls now to see what your opinion is. So this was a budget billed as being for the long term. Do you think that the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, will be around to see the outcome and see his plans through? Or is the budget really a shoo-in for Rachel Reeves? So please vote now. With, as usual, many of the announcements pre-leaked in the press, was there very much to surprise anybody? Clearly, it's not been good news for the smokers amongst us, with a levy to be introduced on vaping liquids from October 2026 and a one-off increase in tobacco duty to ensure that vaping remains a cheaper alternative. There was good news, allegedly, for pubs with a freeze on alcohol duty, and also good news for drivers with a similar freeze on fuel duty for the moment. The Chancellor highlighted that the budget was aimed at achieving long-term growth, but how much capacity did he really have to play with? The OBR think that after the measures announced yesterday, there will be only a slim amount of headroom of about £8.9 billion, which is apparently the lowest there's been on record. And therefore, this severely limits the extent to which the Chancellor could make any more meaningful changes than he did. So with all that said, will the measures that were announced yesterday have the impact that he was saying it would do on work pay, investment and productivity? Phil.
Thank you. So I guess picking up in terms of making work pay, clearly I think the headline and the largest announcement to come out was the reduction in the 2% for national insurance. That's very much aimed at those that are in work. I think for me, potentially the more significant announcement was that the Tories want to eliminate national insurance altogether, what they referred to as essentially a double taxation. National insurance does represent a significant tax yield, so it'll be really interesting to see whether or not they could find the money to be able to do that in the future.
It's really interesting, actually, Phil, as well, because it's the first time that we've really seen a signalling that national insurance is actually deemed to be a tax. So I thought that was quite an interesting revelation. Picking up on the investment side of things, so we saw a number of measures that were introduced in the budget around investment in UK PLC and UK listings. So things like the greater transparency in defined contribution pension schemes, so that you can actually see what assets they're invested in, and to encourage UK equity investments. We've got the launch of a new UK ISA, the British savings bond, to encourage a savings culture, but a savings culture in Britain. It's quite interesting that we've got that alongside the backdrop of a cost of living crisis, and also, you know, the drive for spending to increase the British economy. It's quite interesting to see that actually we've got an encouragement to save at the same time. We've got a focus on accessing non-DOMS money, so some incentives to bring overseas wealth into the UK, which they're forecasting will be about 15 billion. A lot of encouragement on inward investment into key sectors. I guess the bit for me actually on an economic perspective is there a case for investing in UK PLC as opposed to global markets from an investment perspective? So quite an interesting investment landscape.
Yeah, and I suppose the answer to that question will partly come down to whether the UK is productive enough. We hear in the press, in the news for years, that the UK productivity is not keeping up with the other key economies in the world. And so in terms of what was done yesterday for productivity, we've been discussing with lots of businesses recently, actually, what businesses need from government to be able to grow, to improve productivity. And we hear three things consistently. We hear many more, but the three key points seem to be that businesses want a proper industrial strategy. Always interesting as to what that actually means in practical terms, but industrial strategy is top of business agenda. Investment in infrastructure, particularly connectivity, broadband, internet connection, and transport links as well. And I think crucially to address the skills gap, the skills that kids come out of school with just isn't really matching what businesses want in terms of employing people. So those are the three things that businesses are asking for, and really I wasn't convinced there was very much in yesterday's budget for those. In terms of the public sector, though, there was definitely a focus on improving productivity in the public sector. I think that makes obvious sense. Public services are under huge pressure. There's not really any money. Sue, you mentioned a slimmer than ever headroom. There's not really any money to throw at public services. And clearly, with the Conservative Party way behind in the polls, they needed or wanted to deliver some tax cuts. So, if they're not going to spend more on public services, then it's a pretty obvious strategy to say let's spend it better. So it clearly makes sense. But how does one do that? If that was easy, it would have been done years ago. Certainly makes sense, but it'd be interesting to see whether it comes to fruition. And best case scenario, it's going to be years before the public sees benefit in terms of the quality of those services through efficiencies. It's a long-term play, which, great. That's probably what the public want, for politicians to look to the long term and invest for what's best in the long term. But with an election to win as well, it's an interesting balance.
Thank you. Phil, a lot was made by the Chancellor on this being a budget aimed at making work pay. To what extent do you think the changes announced yesterday to cut national insurance for employees from 10% to 8% off the back of the previously announced 2% cut that commenced in January, will that actually have on getting people back to work? Which is what they're talking. They keep saying back to work, but actually we've got quite high employment anyway.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was interesting that it was one of the bigger announcements that came out, but it was something that had been reported in advance, so it wasn't this big kind of shock or surprise announcement that had come through. The numbers quoted for effectively the two reductions, for the 2% in January and then the previous 2%, looking at an average employee saving of £900 a year. And I think if you think about that for a two working parent household, actually that is probably a meaningful amount of money in terms of a tax saving. But I think the ability to use that as a mechanism to get people back into work is probably quite questionable. Like you mentioned, we've got near to or pretty much record levels of unemployment. And so for me, I think there are significantly different and other barriers of getting people back into work. If you take those people that took early retirement, I suspect that level of money isn't the kind of the deal breaker for them that will kind of go, okay, fine, I'll go back into work. And therefore, for a lot of other people, actually the barriers are probably not tax at all. The barriers are probably more things like affordable childcare, and I know we'll come on to talk about that later, flexible working arrangements, whether they've got the right skills, as Alan mentioned, transport. So there's a whole host of significant other areas beyond tax. And again, the budget didn't really pick up on any of those. The other big difference is that this was something for employees. So if you're an employer, the 13.8% national insurance cost of taking on those extra people is still there. And I think for a lot of people that will have an impact on their ability to recruit.
Yeah, and at the risk of sounding overly negative as well, I think it's important to remember that really these recent tax cuts are only giving back, most of the analysis says about 50% of what working families have lost in terms of tax increases over the last 2 or 3 years. Say tax increases, it's more been that the thresholds and limits haven't gone up, which in a period of pretty high inflation has a very significant impact on people's take home pay. And yesterday's announcement, coupled with last autumn's, it seems to be about 50% of that being given back. So this isn't more money in people's pockets; it's just a bit less than it was, or a bit less than it was before. It's also interesting that the national insurance rather than income tax was the target. I think it's obvious why. It's trying to focus on work and making work pay rather than being an across-the-board tax cut. But for those who get their income from other sources, and most notably pensioners, not benefiting at all from this. So pensioners particularly, and others who have their income from other sources, will be paying quite a lot more tax comparatively than they were 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah. And Phil earlier mentioned about affordable childcare being a hindrance to people going back into work. Sharon, were there any specific announcements to deal with the changes here that you think might encourage more people back into work?
Well, I mean, as far as childcare is concerned, nothing specific on childcare, but the interesting thing was trying to rectify an imbalance with the child benefit. So we've got a regime where child benefit is withdrawn once you actually reach a certain level of income. And currently that's adjusted net income of £50,000. Part of the imbalance is obviously if you've got one earner in the family and they're earning above £50,000, then the child benefit is incrementally withdrawn. Whereas if you have two parents earning 49,000 each, then you have no withdrawal, which doesn't seem to be a particularly fair scenario. So there is a plan to rectify that position, but not until 2026, which is interesting that that's been kicked down the road for quite some time, really. In the meantime, actually, what they've done is to increase those thresholds. So from April 2024, instead of income being above 50,000 before the child benefit is starting to be withdrawn, that goes to £60,000. Again, picking up on the points we've made before, when we're in an inflationary environment and wages have gone up through inflation, actually, that's not a particularly significant increase. And the taper has been increased to £80,000. So what it means is actually you lose 1% of your child benefit for every £200 that's above the £60,000, and you lose the child benefit completely once you get to the 80,000. The current regime, you lose 1% of your child benefit for every £100. So we've got a slight different change in that as well. So I think it's great in that actually it is a slightly more fairer position. However, actually we've still got to wait another couple of years before we get actually complete fairness in that.
Yeah, and in terms of childcare specifically, I thought it was really interesting that wasn't really mentioned at all, that I heard anyway yesterday. It was one of the flagship, if that's best I can come up with, policies last year was to get people back into work through a huge expansion in free childcare. We all know that chancellors have a habit of re-announcing things for years on end, and this was something that is to be stepped up over several years. So the fact it wasn't mentioned yesterday, I wonder if that suggests that it hasn't really had the impact that was expected. I don't think any of the changes have been reversed, but they're not being pushed and publicised, which makes one wonder whether they're not really hitting the impacts that were hoped.
And I think if you focus just for a moment on that bit around encouraging people back into work and what that kind of looks like, I think it's worth businesses remembering that you can come up with some quite compelling and attractive benefit packages that will really help with this. I think there's the obvious things like private medical, pension, but there's actually a whole host of other areas. Electric company cars are still incredibly beneficial for employees. areas such as income protection is amazing, actually, how much value employees place onto that. But there's also wider things like mental health in the workplace or mentoring that people actually see lots of value from. So there's lots that businesses can be doing to try and actually encourage people back into the workplace.
So it's more about UK business really supporting this drive, and that's almost what perhaps the Chancellor needs to get on board with this business rather than actually individuals.
Yes.
Because it'll be businesses that have got the capacity to be able to afford to implement more than perhaps the government can.
Yeah, and we'll come on to it later. We talk about the overall tax burden. It is this shift, though, unfortunately, of this tax burden being pushed onto businesses.
Yeah.
So definitely not the approach that the Chancellor seems to be taking.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And moving on, talking about money in businesses, there's been a lot talked about investment into the UK PLC and effectively into UK businesses to drive that recovery within the economy. The Chancellor yesterday talked about UK being very much open for business and being, attracting record sums in terms of investment compared with other countries across the world. But nonetheless, trying to use the budget to stimulate that sort of growth. How do we think that the British ISA and pension changes will encourage investment in UK PLC?
Yeah, so the headline change in that respect yesterday was the new British or UK ISA. Essentially, what that does is increases the limits on what people can put into an ISA in a year. Currently 20,000, now becoming 25,000, but that additional 5 has to be invested in the UK. Exactly how that works in terms of is it a UK listing or because we know there's multinational companies that might happen to be listed in the UK, but maybe don't have enormous amounts of their operations here. So there'll be some detail in that, of course. But essentially what it does is just gives exactly the same benefits as the existing regime, but increases it as long as that stays in the UK. Makes perfect sense in principle. I do wonder just how much impact it can have, because we're talking basically people here who are maxed out on their 20,000. That's not millions of people. It's maybe tens of thousands of people. So we're talking £5,000 times tens of thousands. It's a pretty modest amount of money, but it signals intent, and maybe it's the first step towards trying to focus more investment back into the UK rather than wherever else people might invest. In terms of pensions, I think that's a bit more for the long term, more of a signalling of intent again to show that the government want pension funds to be encouraged and incentivised to invest more of those funds in UK PLC. But that was sort of light on detail and something to be consulted on for the future. Those plans didn't feel particularly concrete at this stage.
Thank you. And we referenced earlier about, as part of this drive for investment in UK, the treatment of non-DOMs was highlighted. But what does this mean about the talent drive to push people into the UK?
Gosh, so I think we've been expecting some kind of change to the non-DOM regime for a period of time. I don't think it was necessarily expected to be under this government. I was interested to see that this change with non-DOMs is being signalled in the budget pack under the heading of simplification of tax. So that always alarms me when I see something that says simplification. We know absolutely that it's not anywhere near as simple as one would expect. So this is probably one of the most controversial proposals in the budget. We've got the abolition of the current non-domicile regime from April 2025. So the current non-dom regime effectively allows individuals with wealth that's sitting outside of the UK to avoid UK income tax and capital gains tax, and to some degree inheritance tax on their overseas income and gains. So the plan is to move to a residence-based scheme as opposed to a domicile-based scheme. So the intention is that for the first 4 years of residence, 100% of your foreign income and gains will be completely exempt from UK tax. However, in the small print, that only applies to new arrivals and also to individuals who have been non-UK resident consecutively in the last 10 years. So that's going to have some sort of limitation. You have to claim that treatment. So again, you've still got to complete tax returns to make that claim. And if you claim it, you're going to lose your personal allowance and capital gains tax annual exemptions exactly the same way as we have in the current regime. You can vary that claim year on year exactly the same as we have in current regime. If you leave within that 4-year period, then you can claim the remaining, years out of that 4-year on your return. That'll be quite interesting to see how that's actually defined and whether or not there's any sort of time limitation set around that. And in that 4-year period, you can remit any of that foreign income and gains, even though it's 100% exempt. You can bring that into the UK, which is a big change from where we are at the moment. Again, touching on the point you were making, Sue, which is this is about actually bringing money into UK PLC, even though it's not necessarily taxed. If you have been resident in the UK before April 2025 within that 4-year period, so if you're UK resident in 2022-23, for example, you can benefit from that new regime as well. It's not just going to apply to people who've come to the UK after April 2025. Once you get to that 4 years, it's a cliff edge. So you're here resident for 4 years, immediately then you move across onto the arising basis and global tax on your worldwide income and gains. So in some respect, actually, it's a simplified structure. We don't actually have any need for kind of segregation, tracking of offshore income, and there's no remittance basis charge after April 2024-25. Statutory residence test is going to be used to determine residence, and there's no change to split year or treaty residence, so there's still some opportunities to plan around that. Interestingly, there's less on the inheritance tax implications of a change of this regime. Inheritance tax operates on a domicile basis, and the plan is to move that across to residence as well. I saw something in the small print that they, although they're going to consult on this regime, the opening gambit is that you'll be UK inheritance taxed on your worldwide assets after 10 years of UK residence. But interestingly, there's a 10-year exit trail. So if you leave the UK, you've got to wait 10 years before actually you're completely clear, which is a lot more punitive than where we are at the moment. There's a lot of stuff in there around offshore trust, and effectively the trust protections are lost from April 2025. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of planning that we'll need to do with beneficiaries and settlers of offshore trusts. No change to excluded property trusts for inheritance tax were established before April 2025. And for those who've got mobile workforce, the overseas workday relief is retained for the first 3 years, but only if you use the new foreign income and gains regime. Interestingly, that only applies for income tax and not for national insurance contributions. So the existing legislation still sits for national insurance. The projections are that essentially this is going to raise an extra 2.7 billion per annum, in addition to the current tax take of about £8.5 billion per annum that the government currently takes for non-DOMs.
And I mean,
Simplification.
Absolutely.
And obviously, it's quite a dramatic change for those who are affected by it. But will there be any transitional rules?
There will, and I think just coming back to that change, I think it will be interesting to see whether or not this encourages existing non-DOMs to stay in the UK, or actually is an encouraging regime for people to sort of come into the UK, because we have seen a drive of non-DOMs leaving the UK progressively for other regimes. So I'm not convinced that actually it's particularly attractive compared to others. As regards transitional rules, you're absolutely right. For those existing non-DOMs, we've got a series of transitional rules, again, not completely straightforward. So the first one is that for the tax year 2025-26, you can have your foreign income exempt up to 50% from UK tax, but not your foreign capital gains. So that 50% transitional rule only applies to income, not gains, so not as attractive as you would expect. There's also a rebasing. We've seen rebasing within the non-DOM regime before, and this typically takes the same sort of pathway. So from April 2019, any disposals after April 2025, we've got a rebasing to April 19. That's subject to conditions that haven't yet been disclosed. And it only applies to people who are currently non-DOM and have claimed the remittance basis previously, again consistent with what we've seen in the past. The interesting thing, and coming back to the investment points that we've talked about before, is that you can remit prior to April 2025 capital gains and income that you have applied the remittance basis for. They will allow a 2-year remittance in 2025-26, 2026-27 of foreign income and gains, and you will only pay tax at 12%. So for those people who are longer term in the UK, don't intend to go anywhere soon, that can be quite attractive, because actually you might find that you've been sitting on offshore income and gains, not feeling that you can bring that into the UK. 12%, actually, that's attractive. But again, this is part of that 15 billion we mentioned earlier that's going to come into the UK coffers. That rule does not apply for foreign income and gains generated within trust structures. And also there's going to be, the other thing is a relaxation on the mixed fund rules, but again, no details. So huge amount of information we're still expecting, particularly around how this is going to work with trusts.
And when we were talking about this, we were talking about, when I introduced this part of our discussion, talking about it being about investment in the UK. And, over the years, in successive budget announcements, different governments have talked about the importance to UK economy of technology and innovation, and how they're going to sort of angle measures to support technology and innovation. There wasn't a great deal about that in this budget, was there, Alan? And can you talk briefly about what there was?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So the government for years has said that the UK tech sector is the what's going to drive productivity growth and growth more broadly. It's particularly prevalent, of course, in the part of the country that we and most of our clients work in, particularly around the sort of greater Reading area in IT and software, and up into Oxfordshire, which huge life sciences hub there. So really important to us and our clients. I think, to be honest, we might have expected more. There were some targeted measures, for example, putting some investment into nuclear tech. There was some specific help for film and TV and that part of the sort of creative industries. Some announcement of investment into Cambridge and London specifically. Nothing, sadly, specific to sort of Oxfordshire and Berkshire area. I think most of our clients most of our technology clients will be disappointed by what they heard, or perhaps more what they didn't hear yesterday. That said, I think there could be some really big opportunities for our clients coming out of the drive for productivity in the public sector, and particularly the NHS. We, as you know better than most of us, so we've got loads of really high quality, innovative businesses out there in med tech and life sciences, and they are essentially out there right now creating the technologies and developing the technologies that the NHS will need to adopt to drive the sorts of productivity gains that have been talked about, and not just the productivity gains, but the quality of outcomes for patients, with AI-driven diagnostics and all that sort of thing. So not because of what was in the budget specifically for tech, but because we hopefully now have the NHS getting ready to buy what our clients are out there developing. So that could be quite exciting for many of our clients.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think that it's fair to say that technology businesses were perhaps looking for a bit more, and there was only a very small reference, Phil, to R&D tax credits, although there are a lot of changes that have previously been announced. So would you like to just sort of give a quick summary and recap on what is going to happen? I think one of our audiences specifically asked a question about if we could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, just to reiterate the message, I guess, which is that for a government that's trying to achieve a high-wage, high-skilled, innovative country, it's really disappointing that there wasn't anything really in relation to R&D tax relief at all. I think the one thing that was mentioned will hopefully be positive. This concept of creating a new advisory panel to help HMRC administer the R&D tax relief. For anybody that has made an R&D claim in the past 6 months, they'll know how difficult it's been with HMRC in terms of the level of inquiries and the attitude that HMRC are taking towards those. So hopefully it will be positive in terms of encouraging a better dialogue between HMRC and the taxpayer in terms of those R&D claims. You're right, though, we're on the cusp now of some really big changes to R&D. There is this concept now of taking the two existing R&D schemes, so we've got an SME scheme and an RDEC scheme, and looking to merge those two schemes together. There were some that were hoping for that to be deferred for another year because it is such a big change that's coming through, but there was no deferral. So that will start for accounting periods starting on or after 1st of April 24. So for a lot of businesses, they will be right on the cusp now of kind of starting to head into this new regime. What that new merge scheme looks like is very similar to the RDEC scheme, which is an above-the-line taxable credit that comes through that's payable to the business, but is then subject to tax. Broadly, the rates that we're expecting are that the taxable credit will be 20% of the qualifying R&D, and then if you're a profitable company paying tax at 25%, the net benefit is effectively 15% after taking into account that tax. For loss-making businesses, there's still the ability to surrender, but that surrender will be at the 19% for small companies rate.
So when you say surrender, you mean actually to get the cash back?
Yeah, exactly. So that's if you're a loss-making company, there's an ability to surrender some of that loss to the extent that it was created through qualifying R&D and then get an actual cash rebate back from HMRC.
Because that's been very valuable to a number of the earlier stage research and development companies, hasn't it?
Completely, yeah. And look, the disappointing thing now is that this new merge scheme is nowhere near as beneficial as the old scheme. Now, we know why the Revenue and the Treasury have made this decision, which is because under that old scheme, there was a lot of abuse. But it's a shame that there wasn't a better way of kind of allowing loss-making, genuine R&D, tech-heavy businesses be able to kind of have a bigger benefit.
It has been a huge success story, really, for the last 5 to 10 years in terms of driving innovation in the sorts of companies we've been talking about, and I guess, would we say, watering down of the scheme and it's it being policed much more for reasons that we understand and agree with, but it has definitely reduced its impact.
Agreed. And then I think kind of touching on Sharon's point and your point around kind of simplification, this was again seen as being a simplification, but to make things complicated, there is still an SME scheme that sort of exists, which is for R&D intensive businesses. So if you are a business whereby actually a significant proportion of your R&D spend is as a percentage of your total expenditure, making you in an intensive R&D business, you could still potentially benefit from some of the schemes that existed before.
But more hurdles.
But more hurdles. There are two other kind of big changes coming. Again, these are for accounting periods starting on or after 1st of April 24. The first is now this restriction over where the R&D takes place. It's something that was announced, I think, back in 2022 and has been subsequently deferred. This is now going to put you into a position whereby if you're doing R&D, it has to be done in the UK for its benefit. For contractors, that will be largely based on where the work is done. For externally provided workers, essentially those externally provided workers need to be operated through a UK payroll, paying UK pay-as-you-earn and NI.
I mean, that can be massively big change for those clients of ours who are in clinical trials, for example, and having to do the clinical trials overseas.
So there is one exclusion. Again, this is all about making things simple, whereby if you have to do the work overseas because of something really quite specific, then you would still be able to make that claim.
But presumably that doesn't affect the economics of doing it. Say in a number of clients, for example,
yes.
we're using Georgia or Bulgaria to do clinical trials because it's so much cheaper.
Yes, agreed. Or if you've got IT businesses that are using IT developers in another country, we see that quite often across lots of different European territories. That's not specific enough. It needs to be we're testing the water in a particular country, and that's the only place we can therefore test that water, and therefore it's quite specific. The second big change is around under the merge scheme, where work is subcontracted out. Can benefit and make the claim for R&D. So if you've got two UK businesses that are undertaking that work, the contracting out rules will determine who can make the claim. Broadly speaking, it will be the principal company, so the company making the decision to undertake the R&D that will be able to make the claim. But there are various complexities. If that principal company is overseas, for example, it might be an overseas parent, then the subcontractor might be able to claim. And then there's some complexity around if the contract never anticipated that part of the R&D taking place, perhaps the contractor can still claim. I think the message here is that this is really complicated, but also how important it is to start looking at it now. There'll be lots of people who will be entering into contracts for this, whereby actually you'll want to know about it now as part of the commercials, whereas historically people have dealt with it kind of after the event. So much more real-time kind of R&D, both understanding those contracts, but also capturing the information is going to become critical.
I think that's quite interesting because that's very much feeding into what Sharon was talking about with the simplification of so-called simplification of tax. But actually, I think what it's seeming to say is you've got to think very, very carefully before you make any strategic measures, whether personally, in terms of where you're going to operate from, or as a business, what you're going to do, whether you're R&D intensive or not, just because that next step could cost you a lot of money, more than you're expecting. And so, Phil, more broadly, we looked at tech businesses, obviously, which we work with a great deal, but was there anything else of interest in the budget for businesses more widely?
Yeah, I mean, in short, no. It will have been extremely disappointing for businesses, across the board. We talked about national insurance dropping for individuals. There's no corresponding change for businesses. Corporation tax still remains incredibly high at 25%. And we know from the businesses that we talk to that 25% corporate tax rate is really having a material impact on their investment decisions. So that was very disappointing. We also talked before the rise in UK tax as a share of GDP, putting us at one of our highest levels in history, goes to show that there is this continual shift of putting the burden of tax now onto businesses. The one corporate tax measure that was briefly referenced was around full expensing. This is the idea that for capital expenditure, you can take full relief in the year of acquisition. For a lot of our businesses that are SMEs, you would have been able to benefit from the 1 million annual investment allowance. So full expensing wasn't hugely that beneficial in the first place. What they announced was that they were looking to extend that to leasing companies, but the details completely lacking. Actually, interestingly, it wasn't in the costing policy document in terms of how much they thought that might cost, which I think demonstrates that this is something that's going to be kicked out into the long grass that they want to do, but there'll be some consultation around it before we get into the real detail.
And do you think perhaps that might have been a response to the previous sort of announcement of full expensing, because it didn't deal with leasing, and so many businesses now actually lease capital assets rather than purchase them outright?
I think you're completely right. I think there was a lot of lobbying that was done before for a lot of businesses to sort of go, look, to what extent, particularly also where you are the person leasing the asset to someone else. There was a lot of lobbying around that in terms of making sure that those businesses weren't left behind. The challenge will be, okay, does it apply to commercial vehicles? What about cars? Like I say, there's a lot of question marks that we still have.
Yeah. So I think now's a good time for us to just move to our next poll question, which is that, reflecting on what's been in the budget and the wider general economic conditions as well, are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic for business growth in the UK over the next 12 months? So if you'd like to just cast your votes now, that would be much appreciated. One of the other tax, of course, that we haven't talked about today, and a little bit of a Cinderella of the tax world at the moment, is VAT. The VAT threshold has been increased for the first time in 8 years, but it's risen by £5,000 to £90,000. There was sort of allusions, I think is probably the best way of putting it, in the Chancellor's statement, to how many businesses, would suddenly say, oh yes, that's fine, now we'll not be suppressing our revenues so that we don't fall into that trap. What do you think? What is the impact on small businesses?
Look, I think any increase will have been welcome. It does take some businesses out of VAT altogether, and it'll give others slightly more time before they need to start thinking about registering for VAT. And we know that at that level, the extra competitive advantage that it gives of not having to charge VAT, particularly where it's to consumers, makes a difference. But it is a very small increase. I can't see that it really is going to move the dial significantly. Again, we've talked about inflation in terms of the knock-on impact. Really, it's probably probably not even moving us in line with inflation, particularly given where inflation has been in the recent period. In absolute terms, it's worth mentioning that it is higher than a lot of competing kind of European countries. I think most countries in Europe, the threshold is much lower, probably closer to 50,000 or lower in some. So I think we're in a good place, but I can't see that this small increase is going to change things.
Thank you. And if there were surprises in the budget, there was certainly one, I think, about the reduction of CGT on residential properties. Why was that, do you think, Sharon, and what was behind it?
So what was announced yesterday is a plan to reduce the main rate of capital gains tax for residential property disposals from 28% to 24%, and that will come in from April 2024. Interestingly, the lower rate of 18% still stays, so that hasn't been reduced in the same way, and the 28% of capital gains tax still remains for carried interest. There's no changes to main residence relief, so this seems to be targeted at making it more of an, incentivising individuals to dispose of investment property and second homes, because most people will actually have an exemption, main residence was an exemption for the disposal of their property, so therefore wouldn't actually pay any tax. So I think it's geared around trying to help people onto the housing ladder. I think it's loosely connected with the furnished holiday lettings changes that we'll come on to shortly. I personally wonder whether that's actually going to really achieve what they want to achieve, because just increasing the supply, potentially, of housing won't necessarily help first-time buyers onto the ladder. especially with the current rates of high interest rates, which don't look to be going much below 5% for any time soon, and the cost of living squeeze. So I think for individuals who are looking to sell their residential properties, that's great. But actually, I'm not sure that it's going to make a massive difference. I think wider, it's quite welcome that for capital gains tax, the regime was largely unchanged. So the business asset disposal relief regime for businesses is the same. We've still got a very low rate of 20% capital gains tax for non-property disposals, which remains very attractive. I question whether that will remain long term. And I think also, it clearly seems that the Chancellor has taken the toys out of the Labour toy box here with the non-dom regime, and one has to sort of look at where are they going to then sort of get an increased tax take should they sort of come into power in a future election. I think sort of capital gains tax is ripe for review. So I think it's a positive. We've got a reduction. I don't think it's going to necessarily achieve the aims that the government are expecting it to achieve in terms of the housing supply, but there will be individuals who can take the benefit of that.
And I mean, you referenced earlier, but talking about property taxes, obviously, there were some what had been much heralded changes to the holiday let environment, weren't there?
Yeah, they were, and this furnished holiday letting scheme has been a little bit of a hot potato for quite some time, because we've obviously got a very different regime for income tax and capital gains tax, as opposed to the inheritance tax regime. And we've had lots of tax cases going through where business property relief for inheritance tax has been denied. We saw years ago in the OBR sort of reviews that there were sort of views that actually you should align the income tax and capital gains tax position and the inheritance tax position in a more favourable way. But actually what we've done here is effectively moved the income tax and capital gains tax position to where the IHD is, which is we're no longer going to have this favourable regime. So the furnished holiday lettings regime ends in April 2025. There will be anti-forestalling rules that come into play from yesterday. So we can't kind of play around with sort of conditional contracts. So furnished holiday lettings for capital gains tax allow you to access things like rollover relief, holdover relief on gifts, business asset disposal relief, capital allowances and pensionable earnings. So it's treated as if it were trading income, although it's actually an investment. So the change in the capital gains tax rate from 24% applies, so helpful in some respects, but nowhere near as good as a 10% rate for business asset disposal relief. The loss of capital allowances on furnishings and plant and machinery, the loss of holdover relief on gifting properties to others, or rollover relief on the reinvestment of money into those properties, is going to hit a number of people. Again, I think it's relatively sort of politically motivated in terms of aiming people in local communities, particularly holiday locations,
He talked very specifically, didn't he, about lobbying from Cornwall and so on.
Correct. And I think this is also, this is coupled with the pinch on council tax and allowing councils to increase the council tax on holiday lettings. So I think there's a double-pronged attack here. But I think, again, just increasing the housing supply in locations and making sort of, let property more available for long-term rather than short-term lets, I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to impact on the local economy for the same reasons that, have people got the money to go and actually buy those properties or to rent those properties? So I think it's generally, I think, what we're seeing with the government and HMRC is an attack on people with property or property-based businesses, and this is just an extension to that.
Thank you. And I think one of the questions that we've been asking ourselves is, we've been waiting for something around inheritance tax, but there wasn't anything in this budget specifically about inheritance tax, although there was a comment, wasn't there, about probate and about commercial loans, Sharon. So could you pick up on that?
Yeah, and again, not huge amounts of detail, but I think essentially, I think there's going to be an easing of obtaining the grant of probate. So at the moment, you essentially have to pay the inheritance tax before you get a grant of probate. Well, a grant of probate is your authority to stand in the shoes of the deceased and to administer the estate. So quite often people are caught where they can't, the assets are frozen until you've got the grant of probate. But actually, if the assets are frozen, you've got limitations on actually how you can fund the inheritance tax to release the grant of probate. And it does mean that, in certain circumstances, executors have been forced to take out loans to be able to fund that inheritance tax. So it seems that is being addressed in the budget. Again, I haven't seen any significant detail on how that's going to be achieved. But we have also seen in the last month a change in that probate process from applying for the grant of probate and the inheritance tax return being separate processes to everything going bundled up through HMRC. So you submit your return and then that automatically flows into the grant of probate. So I think this is then just coming in on the back of that.
Yeah. Thank you. And we've also been asked by a member of the audience about the creative and film production sector. And Alan, you mentioned that had some benefits.
The budget. There were some specific targeted measures for film and creative. I'm not a tax expert, as you know, so but we do have people in the firm specifically that are focused on that sector really closely. So I think that's something we can get back to this person with a bit more detail on. What we certainly can say is that it's hugely relevant to the local economy. There's been
particularly with Shinfield.
For sure, an enormous amount of investment into that sector locally. Direct, in terms of the studios, as you've mentioned, but also lots of businesses popping up and a bit of an ecosystem now, very much growing up around that. So businesses that support and supply into that sector, which tend to be sort of high tech businesses. Certainly something we'll get back to that person.
I thought it was very interesting that one of the announcements in relation to that was for the enhancement of tax credit in relation to visual effects.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is something that historically we've been, as a country, quite good at doing and supporting a lot of the visual effects within Hollywood. So it'll be very interesting for smaller businesses involved in that, how that will actually play out. Okay, so interestingly then, from the first poll that we asked you, which was, and I'll just remind you of the question, which was, do we think that the Chancellor will be around to see his longer term plans as highlighted within the budget through, or is the budget going to be a shoo-in for Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor? 21% of you thought that the Chancellor would still be around. What we didn't ask was whether he'd still be in government to see that. And in response to whether Rachel Reeves would get in on the back of this, a resounding 79% of you thought that this was a budget that would see Rachel Reeves coming in. So anyway, as we start to draw today's session to an end, I just want to ask the panel one final question, which is, what was the single most interesting thing for you in the budget? And Sharon, what would it be for you?
Oh, I think the interesting thing for me is actually what wasn't said. So, we've alluded to earlier on, we have a personal allowance that's been largely frozen for many, many years. We've seen a £70 increase in the last 4 years. We've got a £100,000 limit when that personal allowance tapers away that's been unchanged in years. We've got a 45% tax rate that's come in that was lowered from 150,000 to 125,000, and obviously with that loss of personal allowances in that window, we're at sort of 60% plus. We've got a 40% tax rate that's largely been unchanged in years, and the rates. So despite it was more actually. We've got a headline grab of 2% NIC saving and the saving on that, but ultimately with wage inflation and general inflation, all of those rate bands remaining the similar is obviously going to increase the tax burden. Again, we've got an inheritance tax nil rate band that's been the same since 2009. It's frozen until 2028. No change to inheritance tax. Alan mentioned earlier there was just nothing in there for pensioners who are historically Tory voters. I can't see that there was that much in there for the younger generation. I think it was relatively bland as a budget. It probably hasn't alienated too many people apart from the non-DOMs, but I'm not sure actually it's particularly attractive for anyone, whether that's pensioners, young people, workers or business.
Yeah, I wonder if that's, they've been in government 14 years now. They're running out of things that they wouldn't have already done by now if they were great ideas, I guess. For me, the most interesting thing I read was more in the analysis afterwards, in the media than within the budget itself. The Chancellor was very keen to drum home the point that the average worker is enjoying the lowest tax burden since I think it was 1975. It was certainly 40 odd, best part of 50 years ago. And then, an hour later, Keir Starmer's standing up saying that the tax burden on the country is the highest it's been since 1948. So if average worker is paying the lowest tax in 50 years and the country as a whole is paying the highest tax in, 80 years, how can that possibly be true? But it seems it is true. The analysis suggests it is true. The Chancellor clearly focused the tax cuts on the average worker. Was that just to be able to say that the average worker is now better off than ever before? The reality, therefore, has to be that everyone else is worse off if the country as a whole is paying more tax. And Sharon, you've touched on pensioners. Clearly, that's the case that pensioners are paying significantly more tax. Businesses are paying more tax. The rich are paying more tax, and I think also the poor are paying more tax. We saw an analysis with a bar chart yesterday where the middle bit, yes, it was down, but both sides were up. So I found that really interesting. It's a vote winner for I think they used to call it Mondeo man or white van man, sure. But is it vote loser for lots of other areas? And we all know that older people tend to vote more often. They tend to vote for the Conservatives. So it's there could have been a shooting in the foot there.
Okay, thank you. And Phil.
I think it was a tricky one for businesses because there really wasn't anything of particular interest in there. So for me, I think reading the news and kind of reflecting on things that have happened will be this bit around, is this the final budget before an election? Could we see something happen actually later in the year and there being another fiscal event before the budget?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And now we come on to the results of our second poll. Which, reflecting on the budget announcements and the wider general economic conditions, are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic for business growth in the next 12 months? Bit of a split audience, I think. Just a smidge ahead, optimistic people out there today, 58% of our audience, with 42% being pessimistic, which still is a significant minority. as they would
perhaps
say.
better than we might have expected. You know, with
Potentially.
with the country officially in recession,
Yeah.
with a budget that we've said we don't think is particularly strong for business, the fact that 60% of businesses out there are still optimistic,
Yeah,
pretty encouraging.
indeed. And drawing today to an end now, thank you all very much for listening and participating with your questions. If you have further questions, then please don't hesitate to contact any of us here. I think our contact details are on your screens or available to you, or indeed your usual contact at James Cooper Kreston. We will, of course, be providing you with more briefings as time evolves, particularly around R&D, where the rules are complex, and we will be running very specific updates on those in the coming weeks. So please do keep an eye out for more information, and I wish you all a good day and the rest of the week. Thank you very much.